All right, how's everybody doing? Woo! All right, so looking at the title of my Keystone project, I'm sure that many of you are thinking one thing. Honors humanities, sports, they don't really go together. And generally you'd be right. Our program is not necessarily for our athletic prowess or knowledge about sports, but sports have been a major part of my life. So why is that the case? Well, from a young age, I started playing baseball. Ever since I can remember, at 5 years old, I played t-ball and continued that all the way through high school, being captain of my varsity baseball team. On top of that, I played basketball and ran cross country as well. And so sports are not only a big part of my life, they're also a big part of who I am and why I'm the person that I am today. But on top of just playing sports, I've also always watched them. Whether it be watching a football game with my grandparents at Thanksgiving, or going to Orioles games with my brother and the rest of my family, or of course, going to every Maryland Terrapins football game. Sports have been a major part of my life. But also, when looking at the way that sports have impacted my life, being so close to DC, you have to deal with mascots like that on the left, the Washington Redskin, and also the Cleveland Indian on the right. And as I've grown up, I've had to come to terms with the fact that the teams that I enjoy and the leagues that I enjoy watching propagate the use of this imagery in sports. And so my Keystone was a way for me to dive into this and make sure that I was educated on all the reasoning behind it to try and come to terms with whether or not I wanted to support these institutions going forward. So, what was the main purpose of my project? Well, primarily it was what I just explained, self-education. But on top of that, I wanted to be educated to the point that I could educate others. I wanted to make sure this information was available and accessible for everyone. Because the issue with this is that oftentimes the coverage of these issues tends to be very insular, especially when you get down to the college or even more so at the high school level. When controversies about these mascots come up, they're often just covered by the media in that area. And so oftentimes people outside of that area have trouble getting access to that information. And lastly, I want to promote conscious consumerism. It's the title of this panel, and I'm sure that all of my other panelists agree. It's a very important topic. It's the idea that we should know both the direct and indirect effects of where we're putting our time and efforts and money. And so that's what I wanted to explore with this project. So how did I go about doing that? Well, it was three primary ways. It was a blog, interviews, and a website. Let's dive into each one of those. So first, the blog. This is an example of what one of my blog posts looks like. I tried to keep three main things in mind when writing these. First off, I wanted it to be short. I don't know about you all, but my attention span is like that big at this point. All of my blog posts are under 5-minute reads. I wanted someone who has no background on this issue to be able to come in, give just a few minutes of their day, and leave my post feeling like they have at least a baseline understanding of the conflict. I want them to be colorful and interactive. I wanted to make sure that it was available for everyone and that everyone could find something interesting about the post. And lastly, I wanted to encourage user research. It's kind of hard to see with the post there, but all throughout each post are a ton of different hyperlinks that link to every resource that I used throughout my research process in writing that post. Additionally, each of the pictures are embedded with links that I found incredibly useful in developing my view on this issue. And so I wanted to make it so that people could either come in and get just a quick view of the issue, or spend a little more time and examine this issue to really try and come to terms with it by themselves. Next, I did interviews. This interview was with Dr. C. Richard King, who is the chair of social sciences at the Columbia College of Chicago. He is one of the foremost experts on this issue, and not only has written a book on the issue called Redskins Insult and Brand, but also has edited 2 of the most comprehensive guides to this issue that I've come across. And so if we're able to make it work, there is a very interesting interview clip that's about 2 minutes long. Any chance?
If you click cancel now, it goes away. You have to click it
Yeah, it's a YouTube video. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to work. But what Dr. King goes into with this is how, on the one hand, this issue is hard to deal with because people are very connected to these traditions. But the thing is, in many cases, these traditions have not been around for very long. For example, the Washington Redskin. When did it come about? In the 1960s. And it came about not as a community for people to join in, but it came about as a way to sell merchandise and to sell tickets. And so these traditions are a very interesting phenomenon to study because people have non-commercial ties to commercial interests. But it's undeniable that people do have very close ties to these issues. And sometimes when you get the most pushback is at the high school level, when these communities feel like this represents them and that it represents what their community stands for. And so when you go in and try and change these issues, you have to keep all of these things in mind. So, the blog posts and interviews were all compiled in a website. That's a picture of the homepage of the website. And what you'll notice is that it's very, very clear. It's very minimalist. And the reason that I wanted to do that was to try and minimize distraction. I don't want there to be a lot of different things to click on. I just want it to be, these are the posts, this is the information, take it or leave it. So, what are my next steps in this project? Well, I want to continue researching. Josh mentioned that sometimes people come to their keystones a little late. Sometimes people have lofty ideas about their keystones and have to change it later on. And that was the case with me. So I didn't have quite as much time as I wanted to really dive into these issues, but my keystone definitely does not stop here. I want to continue researching both college teams and go into professional teams. And additionally, I want to continue in my interviews, not only with experts like Dr. C. Richard King, but also with students to feel that they're affected by these issues. And also, of course, with advocates that are fighting to try and make change on this issue. So, I'd love to take you through a bit of a comparison. One of my posts was about these two teams, and I would love to just walk that through with you. So, on the left here, you have the University of Notre Dame, the Fighting Irish. It's one of the most interesting names in college sports, and it has a wonderful history behind it. And then on the right, you have the University of Illinois, the Fighting Illini. You may not be familiar with this mascot. It was discontinued in 2006, actually forced into retirement by the NCAA when they came out with a report of 15 teams that they believed contained derogatory imagery around Native Americans. But the history behind that is equally interesting. So why is one uncontroversial and seen as a clever name, and the other one was so controversial that it was actually forced into retirement? Let's look at the history. So, what are the similarities? Well, at their core, both target specific ethnic groups. You have one being the Irish and the other being Native Americans, specifically the Illinois Confederation. Both rely on stereotypes for entertainment. You have the classic red hair and leprechaun outfit of the Fighting Irish, and then the falsified Native American regalia of the Fighting Illini. So, once again, why is one controversial and one's not? Let's look into it. Notre Dame was founded in the mid-1800s by a group of Irish Catholic priests. They purchased the land in South Bend, Indiana, to become a safe haven for Irish students, specifically Irish Catholic students. Even today, there's a very strong emphasis on Catholicism and the Irish history of the school. It's rooted in persecution. The way that the name actually came about was when the Notre Dame football team was playing teams in the late 1800s, they would be called names like the Papists and the Catholics and even the Dirty Irish. And so this name was actually a way that students took all that bigotry and persecution and turned it into encouragement for their team. And the name reflects a shared identity. More so in the 1800s when the vast majority of students were Irish Catholic, but even still today, students take pride in the fact that in the Irish influence behind their school and the Catholic influence behind their school. And so it's a shared community that they can all take part in. Let's compare this with Illinois and Chief Illiniwek. This has no history of Native American influence. It was created in 1926 by assistant band director Ray Dvorak as a way to get students pumped up during the halftime show of the marching band. It was created for entertainment purposes, not as a way to show respect, but instead as a way to make a more or less funny dance for the students to enjoy. It was created with the help of student Lester Ludwig in 1926, who drew on his extensive knowledge of Native American culture that he learned from the Boy Scouts. And yes, that is not false. He states that the dance is based on what he learned in the Boy Scouts. It's from and for white students. In the 82-year history of the tradition, from 1926 all the way through 2005, when Chief Illiniwek made his last dance, there was never a student of color who performed as Chief Illiniwek. It was always a white student. There was only one female student who ever performed, and it was during World War II when all the male students were fighting. And Illinois, at its core, is dominated by white students. And this isn't necessarily something against Illinois. Many colleges today still are. But when you choose to have a mascot like this, like Chief Illiniwek, it does not come off as shared identity in any way. It comes off as stolen identity. And that's a very important differentiation and why I believe that Leprechaun is still considered funny and uncontroversial, and Chief Illiniwek is clearly not and is very clearly offensive. So this issue is changing, and it's changing more and more rapidly as we go throughout history. It's something that's really very exciting. A lot of people don't remember that even in just the 1970s, that Stanford was the Stanford Indians, and today they're the Stanford Cardinal, and very few people remember that. In 1990, the University of Miami, Ohio changed from the University of Miami, Ohio Indians to the Redhawks. In 2006, the University of Illinois finally dropped Chief Illiniwek. But people are still fighting about this issue. 10 years later, Illinois does not have a mascot, and they're not projected to have a mascot anytime in the near future because students are still so up in arms about this. This specifically speaks to how clearly people feel connected to these traditions. And it'll be really interesting to see in the future as this issue comes more and more into the limelight and more teams begin to change, if we'll see the University of Illinois student body's opinion change on the issue. In 2016, the University of North Dakota, after a 20-year conflict, finally changed the University of North Dakota Fighting Hawks. And actually just yesterday, I had to add this late last night, McGill University in Canada, after a protest led by Thomas Jarusek on the left, who is an indigenous student and also a varsity athlete on the rowing team, he led a protest of over 10,000 students. And by a completely student-led effort, they managed to get the university to create a petition to ask the students whether or not they wanted it. And just last night, the students voted 78% saying that they didn't want to be represented by this mascot any longer. This is very exciting, and I think it really points to the change that's on its way. So, what are the main takeaways for me in this project? For better or for worse, this is an emotional issue on both sides. It's a different question whether or not both sides are merited in feeling emotional about this issue, but people are connected to these mascots, and it's important to keep that in mind when addressing this issue. But tradition does not equal culture. Just because your grandparents and your great-grandparents celebrated this mascot, that does not make it your own culture to celebrate. It's important to make that differentiation because oftentimes something that has been done for a long period of time is not the correct thing to do. And lastly, change is possible and on its way. The example of McGill University is a perfect showing of this. It's on its way, it's coming whether or not we like it. And I think that this is a great thing for sports. I've always seen sports as a unifying force in my life, as something that's made me a better person and shaped me into the person that I am today. And I believe that sports can return to being this for everyone by taking out these divisive symbols and making it a unifying thing that everyone can enjoy.